So what martial arts would Batman actually train? Last time we talked about the 127 styles thing and kind of what the reality of that would look like. If we were going to be trying to recreate something like that ourselves, what would we be doing, right? And at the end of that video, we talked about how, yeah, you could probably do it in like 9 styles. And honestly, doing certain compressions and everything, you could get away with it a little, probably even a little bit less. And that's not gaining mastery, that's gaining something roughly equivalent to a black belt, like a traditional judo black belt, maybe not the 10-year BJJ black belt. So, right, 127 just isn't an option. We know that. Let's go over quickly just a selection, and this is a selection of people that Bruce trained with to become Batman on his roughly 12-year sojourn. And granted, this was before he became Batman. He kept learning after he became Batman. And look, before I get going on this, I actually asked Scott Beatty, the guy that came up with the number 127 on Twitter, X, and I got a reply. I'll post it up here. If you guys have seen my social media recently, you'll have seen the screen cap of that anyway. Yeah, they just made that number up. They didn't actually go through the pages and identify everything. And here's the kicker. In general, Bruce was training with people who were multi-stylists. He wasn't training with people who were doing one thing, with a couple of exceptions, right? So even though I wrote them down here, look, early on, right, when he was an older teenager, he trained with Ted Grant, who eventually became Wildcat, in boxing. So we know that he had a good foundation of boxing early on. If you look at Batman the Knight, he was digging into like Taekwondo books and stuff as well, right? So because he had a massive library because of his parents, his family's wealth. We also know that in his 20s, he went through FBI training. Now, FBI training is not all combatives. In fact, it's mostly not combatives. It is an intelligence agency. But he did go through FBI training, and that would include their, firearms quals and everything. And we do know that he trained firearms with multiple different people, even though he doesn't use them. He's trained archery with multiple people, including Oliver Queen, the Green Arrow, right? We're not going to get too deep in all of the weapons training. Just understand that, like, even though he does not use firearms these days, not since the Golden Age and the Comics Code Authority and everything, he does know how to use them, and he's quite good with them. It's just that he just has a rule against using firearms. So, look, we know he has trained with Ra's al Ghul. Yes, it is pronounced Ra's al Ghul. According to the guys that actually created him, it's Ra's al Ghul. That is the Arabic pronunciation. I don't speak Arabic, but it's not Raz, it's Ra's. League of Assassins, right? We know that Ra's has lived multiple lifetimes. He's, quasi-immortal because of the Lazarus Pits. And he has been shown to train all sorts of things, and he has his own kind of synthetic style of how he does things that he has kind of, let's just say, Jeet Kune Do together, synthesized together over his lifetimes of experience in how he believes things work. One of the names that pops over and over and over again is this Korean master, Kirigi, who's either a master of Korean martial arts or every martial art or whatever. And again, the time that Bruce spent with him, he would not have been able to learn every martial art under the sun. He would have learned a rough synthesis. He probably would have learned a baseline of fundamentals and then a cherry-picked set of unique things from disparate arts. Here's another one, Sunetomo, ninjutsu, because of course he has to train under somebody for ninjutsu because you just can't have Batman without him being part ninja, right? And besides the fact, he's trained with the League of Assassins, you'll see later on, assassins and manhunting and bounty hunting. He's got that, intelligence and assassination and all of that subterfuge kind of stuff goes right along with it, right? Is ninjutsu a martial art? No, right? The taijutsu tactics, the body-to-body fighting tactics, and the weapons tactics that you see like in the Bujinkan are almost separate from the ninjutsu proper. Ninjutsu is intelligence gathering, right? It's spying, subterfuge, all that kind of stuff. All right, he's got another guy named Chu Chin Lee who taught him Kung Fu. they do this in every anime as well, right? They just go, oh, here's a kung fu guy, right? And you see all the memes and they just lump kung fu unless you have something very specific, like, Wing Chun gets singled out, Tai Chi gets singled out. But we already know that there are dozens, if not more, kung fu styles, right? And a lot of them are quite different from each other. Some of them are very similar, but some of them are quite different from each other, let alone all the various lineages and whatnot. But they do this in anime too, right? In anime, they will often use the term Kempo, right? If you've watched the Rurouni Kenshin reboot, one of the early antagonists is a Kempo master. Well, they're not talking about Ed Parker American Kempo, right? They're not talking about the stuff that I grew up doing. They are using Kempo in the original Japanese term, which meant Chinese martial arts. It was the generic term for Chinese martial arts. In other words, it's the Japanese way of saying Kung Fu. So when you hear Kempo master in anime, they're literally saying Kung Fu master the same way that Americans say Kung Fu master. And they're generally talking about a guy who's trained a bunch of different things. Well, why do we look at Kung Fu that way? Well, because a lot of Chinese guys, especially if you start talking about coming up through the 1800s, were training at schools that did a multitude of styles. You had things, I'm forgetting the name of it. You had various schools that, did multiple martial arts. And granted, it was not all of the martial arts. It was like 4 or 5. But that was kind of the precursor to the modern wushu thing, which is kind of a synthesized, performance-based art as opposed to combat-based art. And again, even in wushu, there's Changchuan and Nanchuan, and there's wushu Tai Chi, and then wushu Sanda, and so there's the state-sponsored stuff that is this very standardized whatever, but these early schools were more like Chinese MMA schools, except they weren't MMA in the way that we think of MMA, like Muay Thai and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and whatever else you want to throw in there. They were MMA in the sense of they were this style plus that style. They were often a couple of northern styles, or a northern style and a southern style, or whatever. And again, it could be 2 to 5 styles, not like 80. All right. There's one that I haven't even read this comic. This is just something that popped up when I was looking. He trained with these guys in the Ten-Eyed Brotherhood in Africa who were demon slayers. I don't even know what combat for demon slaying looks like. Obviously the drawings always just look like normal combat plus some magic, but so there's that, right? And then we know he trained with Zatanna and Zatara, and learned actual stage magic, and more recently at least he was refused to learn real magic because they believed that it would completely consume him, which is probably true. We have Henry Ducard and David Kane, and where's the other one? Willie Doggett up in Alaska. These guys, manhunting, assassination, bounty hunting, that kind of stuff. Now, those are not martial arts per se, but they are conflict resolution things, and they are tracking people down and whatnot, and that would go in with that ninjutsu thing, which is why I included them on the list. There's another, Japanese guy, Shihan Matsuda. Shihan's not a name, right? It's a title. But Shihan Matsuda, kind of undefined, but, Japanese martial arts, including things like Buddhist meditation stuff, which honestly, a lot of it is stuff you would see, like Shaolin feats, but your Japanese martial arts, but generally undefined. Richard Dragon, who is just one of those DC masters of martial arts. Again, another character that's done everything. Then he learned Taoist arts from Shaola and Shentan. And the Taoist martial arts include things like Tai Chi, Bagua, Xingyi, straight sword, kind of this proto-parkour stuff like light body kung fu. Of course, there's just the Taoist philosophy side of things. This would have essentially been like the full suite of Wudang martial arts. And that kind of covers a good list of what he did, right? And if we just go through that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that is 13 things. And, Some of these he would have spent more time. Some of these he would have spent less time. I believe his time with Willie Doug, or not with Willie Doug, his time with Richard Dragon was after he became Batman. So like there's a bunch of stuff in here. And here's the other thing, right? You start with one thing, you become good at it, and you kind of build and stack on top of it. You don't have to relearn the fundamentals every time, and that does speed up the process. It's still a massive list, though. It's still an absolutely massive list. And of course, when you have all the time and money, you can dedicate a lot more time and money in all your recovery. And he's not Batman yet for most of this. So again, he doesn't have to go out fighting crime the whole time. He can just kind of devote himself to the learning process, which most of us can't do. So if you were going to do this in the real world, if you were going to do all this stuff in the real world, we're going to kind of leave out the ninja stuff, the spying and intelligence stuff. You can absolutely learn that stuff, but let's just go for the martial arts side of it. What are we actually going to be learning? Well, look, one of the things that we know from looking at mixed martial arts statistics is that boxing is the king of striking, and then just general Western kickboxing is number 2, right? Muay Thai is not number 2. Taekwondo is not number 2. Karate is not number 2. There's a reason for this. And there's a reason that I'm including kickboxing. I'll get to that in a second. Every single martial art that isn't boxing, every striking martial art that isn't boxing, that has become a like truly formidable force on the world stage, added boxing. We see this over and over and over again, right? Kung Fu styles added Western methods that include boxing and wrestling to create Sanda. And Muay Thai, back when it was the various Muay Baran styles, in the 1920s, it added Western boxing and became Muay Thai. Nobody talks about the Muay Baran styles anymore, but the boxing changed it. Savat adopted English boxing to make it better. We see this over and over and over again, right? So adding Western boxing to whatever you're doing is a necessary component. Now I'm saying go ahead and be training kickboxing. Here's the caveat on that. When we look at the striking statistics in MMA, what we have to realize is that it's about 15% of effective strikes are kicks. 15%, right? That means 85% is hands. Now, if you really like kicking and you want to specialize in kicking, bump it up 5%. Don't bump it up 20%, right? You should be spending 80+% of your time on your hand techniques, on your straight boxing techniques, and then into all of your accessory hand strikes, forearm strikes, elbow strikes, and clinch striking. All of that goes into it, but start from that foundation of boxing. And again, so I say kickboxing because you can kind of shortcut the boxing there, but that does mean that you should probably be spending 80% of your time, at least, on the boxing side of it, and allow that other stuff to bring in. And now if you want to go into specialization phases where you focus on certain techniques, kicks, knees, elbows, clinch strikes, whatever, by all means, right? But specialization phases, as opposed to making it a through line, is a different story, right? Absolutely wrestling. One of the things they don't really ever talk about in here, but absolutely everybody, if you look at when Batman was created in the 40s, it was 39, but if you look at Batman in the 40s, what was going on in the world, right? Everybody that was a fighter in the American world and the Western world was looking at boxing and wrestling because that was the foundation of everything. People were going absolutely nuts for the explosion of jiu-jitsu, which eventually became judo, and that was being added onto it. And if you look at the old catch wrestling manuals, they were adding the jiu-jitsu. They were often spelling it jiu-jitsu, but we all know that's just incorrect romanization. They were adding that for, like, if I'm wearing my 3-piece suit and walking down the street, here's how I use the jacket to do the thing. right? Occasionally you will see just a wrestling hold being applied, and the caption will say, well, this is a jiu-jitsu technique. Like, we're pretty sure that the common leg triangle that everybody does, it came from judo jiu-jitsu. So I would argue, learn catch wrestling. Now, you probably want to learn catch wrestling from the platform of maybe amateur wrestling first. You may not want to go directly to the original old school historical style. You may want to go with like the Japanese shoot style, or amateur plus submissions or whatever, because there's a more dynamic, faster paced, more aggressive component to it. And a lot of that is just a product of the rules and the scoring systems. And when you look at somebody like Batman, he doesn't have time to sit there entangled. He has to finish fights quick, which generally means you're going to want something that has, not necessarily more aggression, but I would argue more aggression and more definitive finishes. But absolutely, he'd want to know pins, because that's going to come in later, right? So I would argue catch wrestling, but any good amateur wrestling would be fine. We'll come back to grappling in a minute. Probably should be learning some kind of long fist traditional martial arts style. Why am I adding traditional martial arts styles? Well, the fact is that traditional martial arts styles include a lot of that middle ground stuff that you don't see in boxing and kickboxing. Even in Muay Thai that has clinch fighting, the amount of grabbing you to manipulate you, throw you around, put you on the ground, strike you on the ground, all that kind of stuff appears over and over and over again in traditional martial arts, because they were largely designed for self-defense, for street fighting. That's a really, really important idea. Now, do you have to go and learn every single long fist style? Well, no, right? Because you're going to see a lot of repetition over and over and over again. Now, the easy thing to pick on would be something like, say, Northern Shaolin or something, like that. Choi Li Fut would be a great one, except Choi Li Fut's extraordinarily technique heavy, right? 100+ forms, but it's got loads of weapons in it, right? So there's pluses and minuses there, right? And then you would want a close quarters TMA. Now, look, I'm a Wing Chun guy, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's really hard to find a good Wing Chun school. So if you can't find a good Wing Chun school, find another something, right? And close quarters could be one of the Okinawan karate styles. I would very much recommend something like Silat. Silat does something that a lot of people don't, and they work a lot of kneeling stuff. They will get down and work the lower gate stuff down on the ground, where they're not necessarily grappling like BJJ, but they're down in that kneeling position and attacking your legs with a knife or with grappling maneuvers. And that's really useful. So I think Silat is a good option there. Again, the various Okinawan karate styles, you find one of these neoclassical karate schools that is actually working like legit karate and not just Japanese kickboxing. And you will find some really, really good stuff. You can find this in some White Crane schools, Bakmei, Jiaoga, and not Jiaoga, Chaoga praying mantis, right? As technically speaking, they're like the same name, but they spelled them differently for the sake of marketing, whatever. Jiaoga is a completely different, more of a long fist style, and that's already a hybridized style mixed with a bunch of things. Chaoga praying mantis, it's a Hakka style. Most of the Hakka styles are pretty good. They're that close range style. We were talking kind of these Southern Chinese martial arts are pretty good. Hungar, right? Hungar has a lot of body conditioning. That's a really good facet. So you can play with stuff in that realm. And again, pick one, or pick a couple, right? But pick one and get something in there, right? So that way you have stuff at all your full reach and big dynamic movement, and with like big steps and lunges and leaps and stuff. You want that, but then you also want the stuff that is grounded and close and in the pocket. Really, really important stuff. Then you're definitely, we're back to grappling, right? You're going to want some kind of equipped or jacket wrestling. Now, for most people, that is going to be going judo, jiu-jitsu. But if you can get your hands on it, Sambo is mean judo that's got some catch wrestling involved in it. So Sambo would kind of take care of wrestling and jacket together, right? If you want to be more stripped back, you could, again, do something like Shuai Jiao, Bok, You could go with like some of the more folk styles of wrestling that do jacket wrestling, but a lot of those end up being even more and more and more stripped down. So you got to play a little bit carefully with that, but being able to use your clothing, use your jacket is going to be really good. Now we get to weapons, right? Traditional weapons. Traditional weapons means a whole lot of things, but what I'm saying by traditional weapons is I mean manual weapons, cold steel, and sticks and things like that. And look, most places are going to have their own kind of specialization. Like if you go to a Japanese swordsmanship school, you're going to learn just that thing. If you go to a more broad-based thing, you might also learn spear and maybe some archery and maybe a short sword, maybe how to use the dagger. And that's part of like what the whole ninjutsu thing, right? So if you went Bujinkan and actually went to a good school that deals with the weapons and all that, you could end up playing with that stuff. A lot of Chinese martial arts, like again, Choi Li Fut has a ton of weapons. Bak Mei has a bunch of weapons. So you can get a lot of that traditional martial arts training just rolled right in with some of these traditional martial arts. That's really good. Like, look, I went the HEMA route, and I think HEMA is fantastic. And the thing I like about HEMA is it's a little more self-exploration directed, right? You pick a source, find a group of guys, and you go. And that works really, really, really well, at least if you have a good head on your shoulders. But the thing about the traditional weapons is we know that the traditional martial arts kind of come from the traditional weapons, and we know that grappling is the backup to weapons. So it really cinches all of that in. And if you're not using firearms, but you may end up using a traditional weapon, then having those skills in your back pocket where they can overlap and intersect the way they're supposed to, that really works out well in your favor. Then you're going to want to deal with improvised weapons. Now, look, the best improvised weapon to start with is a stick. It is the most human thing you could possibly do. You could also argue a rock, but the thing is with a rock, mostly you're going to be looking at either a fist pack or throwing it, right? A stick is something you can continue to swing. Well, Filipino martial arts is good at translating from the traditional sword and knife to the stick. And some of them even deal with long sticks. You know, the Filipino spears are short, but you still get some spear techniques in certain systems. So you can play with that. Some HEMA actually has some stick fighting to go with it. Quarterstaff is a backup for pole arms, particularly for the poleaxe. The great stick, you know, the 5-footer, the baton in Savat and Lacan is based off of the longsword, right? Jogo de Pau does the same thing, and the Italian, I don't remember exactly what they call it, but there's an Italian great stick one. You know, we have the cane, which is based off of one-hand sword, usually a saber. You know, and again, we see that in Lacan, we see that in single stick. The Polish had palsati, and again, that's all based off of saber techniques. They didn't generally go too much smaller. There was occasionally truncheon or cudgel play. In Paulus Hector Mayer, you see the peasant stick, which is literally just like a tree branch. But that stuff usually is far less technical and more just hit the other guy and make him bleed. So like improvised weapons is good, but then you also want flexible weapons even. Now, look, I'm not a huge fan of flexible weapons. But you know who does really well with flexible weapons? The Chinese, again, right? You have the rope dart and the meteor hammer and the chain whip. They have the 3-sectional staff. They kind of have their own nunchuck version. Of course, Okinawa Kobudo has that. And Kobudo is very good for improvised weapons too, because you're using kind of everyday objects. And some Chinese martial arts have like a bench form and various things like that. So you can find things that work in that realm. One of the things that Silat does is playing with the sarong, and that can be extremely useful. Nobody else really does that. But that goes to more equipped fighting, using your clothing or using flexible weapons as both offensive weapons and restraints and stuff like that. Stuff that's worthwhile playing with. And then, of course, this just goes in with some of this other stuff. You got to learn modern weapons. You need to know what it is to deal with modern knives, modern firearms, both handguns and long arms. It's probably a good idea to get familiar with things like explosives and artillery and things like that. Not because you want to use that, but because you don't want to be ignorant of it, right? Now, look, I think you should probably carry a firearm. There's no better equalizer in this world, but sometimes that is not a legal possibility for you, and you have to resort to other things, but it doesn't mean that you should be ignorant of it. There was a great story of some kid from Japan who couldn't have a firearm, learned on airsoft, and then came to the States and was like scoring perfect marks when he went to the range. Like he was just acing everything they threw at him. And he had just trained on airsoft. Now, I'm not telling you to go train on airsoft, but it's at least a start. And then finally, we're going to just throw in just kind of one big bundle: combatives, anti-sentry techniques, and arresting techniques. This all goes in with that kind of quasi-military, paramilitary stuff where you're just looking at the quick, cheap, easy fight enders. This is where Krav Maga lives. This is where McMap lives. And look, a lot of people look at that stuff as a joke, and there is some criticism, legit criticism to be had. But combatives, at least as a mindset, gets you out of the sport mindset and gets you out of even the self-defense or traditional mindset. It's stuff that's not necessarily legally defensible as self-defense, but is probably good for you to know if you get into a fight. Anti-sentry stuff is literally more of this ninja stuff, right? Anti-sentry stuff is literally sneaking around and taking out guards so that you can open up a breach in a perimeter and gain entry. Anti-sentry stuff is extraordinarily useful, and the stealth component could not be overlooked. And of course, arresting techniques. You want to know arresting techniques, and this is where wrestling and pins come back in. You don't want just the 3-second pin, though. You want stuff where you can actually put somebody into restraints. You want to be able to control somebody's body on the ground, up against an object, whatever, long enough to put restraints on, free yourself, and move on to the next thing. And so arresting techniques are extraordinarily useful, right? Arresting, compliance, and whatnot. Now, the thing that I did not include in here is any of like the parkour or anything like that. Look, you want to know how to fall really well? Well, guess what? Aikido is some of the best at falling. And, if you want hard falls, right? The Shuai guys do hard falls beautifully. Judo guys do hard falls beautifully. Aikido guys do soft falls wonderfully. If there's anything you can take away from Aikido, it's falling. Their break falls are phenomenal. And then like any to go along with the parkour, anything like acrobatics or unconventional stuff, right? Do you want to do like drunken boxing or capoeira or Taido, dog boxing? Some of this stuff that is way unconventional, but maybe enough to throw somebody off. You may want to throw something that's unconventional in there, and that would even include some of this the stupid acrobatic stuff that you see in like wushu and taekwondo tricking. There's some really good stuff in there just for the athleticism and whatnot. Again, I wouldn't make that the core of my martial arts training, but as something to add into your workouts and your training on the side could actually be somewhat valuable, particularly the parkour thing. And if you want to do that from a martial arts framework, I mean, the closest thing would probably be, the Wudang light body techniques, but that's mostly just wall running. You might as well just go parkour. It's easier to find anyway. And you can just bootstrap it, how to add that into your martial arts, since it kind of was attached to martial arts in a tangential way from the beginning. So look, in order to become Batman, you still have to learn a lot, and you're still talking about a decade's worth of training to get to roughly equivalent to black belt, right? To get to that competitive, fighter level, not even expert, but just fighter level on all this stuff. But it might be a worthwhile endeavor. Most people that I've met, they don't have more than 4 or 5 black belts, maybe up there like 7, but you rarely meet somebody that's got more than like 7 black belts. Sometimes those are honorary ranks. It is extraordinarily unlikely that you're going to find everything. And like I said, within this list, sometimes you can find a lot of this under one house, right? You can find the traditional weapons and the long fist under one roof. You can find like the wrestling and jacket wrestling and even kickboxing under one roof in Sambo, right? So you can get some of this stuff all kind of under one roof. And again, you're not obligated to go and get a black belt, a black belt, a black belt, a black belt, a trophy, a title, whatever. Find a base for you and build everything around it. I was talking with a guy just recently who was talking about wanting to like really chase down more and go deeper in Filipino martial arts. He just found kind of like he feels at home there. And it's like, well, then do that. Whatever you do, like pick a hub, pick a set of principles and ideas as your baseline, and that way you can expand and contract from whatever that baseline is. So if you need to go from a close quarters baseline out to a long fist, well, you've already got close quarters covered. So slowly learn how to expand that circle until you're getting out to the edge of your range. And then do that with weapons as well. If you're a long fist guy, slowly work in, right? If you're a grappling person, slowly start adding striking in, and vice versa, right? You can do this in a way where you have a hub of one or two or three things, and then kind of build this, let's just say, satellite base around what you're doing. Because at the end of the day, what does all of this have in common? What was Bruce Lee right about? We're all just humans. 2 arms, 2 legs, a body, a head. We're all kind of get to the same place eventually. Like punches are punches and kicks are kicks. And, holds and throws are holds and throws. And there can be a lot of micro variation based on the individuals and the circumstances. But in the broad strokes, there's only a handful of things that you can do. You can only torque a shoulder so many ways. You can only throw a straight punch so many ways. And so you don't need to go and chase down every art that does every variation. You don't really need that. What you need to do is you need to have a baseline and then play with variation on your own. Work outside of your comfort zone. And if that takes you finding some way to randomize training, or if that takes you going to seminars and having somebody lead you as a teacher or as a mentor or just as a older brother, whatever, outside of your comfort zone, whatever that takes, do that. But yeah, even as we've seen with Batman, mostly he's training under people that are multi-stylists. He's not training under one guy for one art, one guy for one. You couldn't do that. You just couldn't do that. And so when we're looking at this, we want to be taking a look at what are the principles we're chasing after? What is the framework we're chasing after? What is our proposed context? Right? And again, this does not apply to you. If you want to go and be the next Gordon Ryan, you have to train sport jiu-jitsu. Training boxing is not going to help that. Not directly. And, if you want to be the next whoever, right, following a certain sport, right, if you want to be the next Muhammad Ali, you got to train your boxing, right? And you got to put your focus on that. But if you are looking after a more generic, general context, if you were looking for self-defense, mixed martial arts, street fighting, combatives, things that are much more open-ended, then you're going to want a much broader base. And like, you could do a lot worse, right, than this right here. And starting with boxing and wrestling, seriously. Don't ask me why. Maybe it's just the fact that over time they specialized. But one of the things that we know for sure is that all the most dominant striking arts became that way by adding Western boxing. All of the grappling arts did it by adding Western wrestling. Even Brazilian jiu-jitsu took a lot from catch wrestling. Jigoro Kano built judo by adopting some of the conventions of wrestling. You can maintain the thumbprint and the identity of your art and still borrow from others. But we know for sure boxing and wrestling, in whatever form you're picking, but right now we're talking about Western boxing and early style, not necessarily the modern stuff, but Jack Dempsey style and earlier boxing and wrestling. Mostly we'd be talking about American folk style and catch-as-catch-can wrestling, although you could be looking at Olympic wrestling as well. those are the foundation. Those are the foundation that have made things a force to be reckoned with. Everything else comes in on top of them. It's where everybody should start. Just find a flavor of that gets you started. And that doesn't even have to become your hub, right? Wing Chun is my hub, but I came to Wing Chun kind of in the middle of my journey. So just because you start somewhere doesn't mean that's where you have to keep your center. It's just something to get you some idea of movement competency and decision-making under pressure, and a stripped down enough rule set that you streamline the decision-making process. It's extraordinarily valuable. Everybody should probably start with a sport martial art and move into more traditional or serious real-world martial arts afterwards. All right, I have prattled on long enough, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. Check us out on our other socials, and please head over to blacksunboxing.com to get a little more info, including how to contact us. Furthermore, if you are in the Phoenix area, please feel free to stop in, say hi, join in for a class, whatever. Also, if you ever see us cite sources or just for additional content, please check out our Substack. That is where we put all of the sources we use in our videos and is a major part of this. Plus, it serves as a membership platform for long distance learning and for people who would like to support us but aren't local. We would greatly appreciate it if you signed up. Even just the free membership helps us out a lot. All right, I will see you guys in the next video. Good journey.